Hi, everyone, and welcome to Cafe IBTTA. I'm Pat Jones. My guest today is Andrew Fremier. Andy is the Deputy Executive Director for Operations of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area. Andy also serves as Deputy Executive Director of the Bay Area Toll Authority. Before joining MTC, Andy served as Chief Deputy District Director for Caltrans District Number 4. A licensed civil engineer, he held a variety of positions during his 20 years at Caltrans, which included leading the toll bridge and highway construction program and developing the toll bridge seismic retrofit program. Finally, Andy is the 2023 president of IBTTA. Andy, welcome to Cafe IBTTA. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Pat. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody.
And Happy New Year to everyone. I see nice New Year's greetings coming in from Vicky Dewey and Greg LaFleur and Charlie Mitchell and others. A fond Happy New Year to all the members of IBTTA. Well, today, a big shout out to the Transportation Research Board and their new executive director, Victoria Sheehan. TRB is holding a fabulous event this week at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center. And we salute you and your more than 10,000 attendees. Go TRB. Well, this is Cafe IBTTA, where we drink coffee or whatever your favorite beverage is, and we talk about things that are interesting, relevant, uplifting, and fun. And we are taking your questions, and we want to get started right away. Why don't you tell us what your hobby is? Some of you know that Andy Fremier is a very competitive tennis player. He says his rating is about 3.75 or maybe 4. That doesn't mean anything to me, but I think it sounds good. So we want to hear about your competitive or non-competitive avocation or hobby. Tell us in the chat, what do you like to do when you're not sitting in the office or traveling around drumming up business for your company? All right. Well, this was inevitable. We were going to see pickleball, right, Andy?
Yep, that's for all the old timers in the group, I think.
Making and drinking wine. I like that, Jim Wilson. Hiking, biking, fishing, golf. I think there's a bunch of those in there that are for you, Andy, too, huh?
I see quite a few skiing. I like to see that.
Skiing, lots of skiing.
National parks. I'm with Vicky in the national parks.
Beautiful, beautiful. Running around the neighborhood with the dog. Yes. Yes, especially if you own a dog, you can't avoid that, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for all the great responses to the hobby. We'll have to remember this question in the future because it really gets people going. Andy, I want to turn to you and ask you to tell us a little bit about your portfolio at MTC and IBTTA. It's a big organization. It's a complex organization. Tell us a little bit about the goings on there and what you're responsible for.
Sure, Pat, I'd be happy to, and hopefully it's of interest to folks. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission, really at its root, is the Bay Area's metropolitan planning organization. But over the years, the state has seen fit to add a bunch more responsibilities onto the agency and has really created a very broad portfolio. So while we became the Metropolitan Planning Organization, primarily responsible for delivering the regional transportation plan in the 1970s. By the late 1980s, the state added on the tolling responsibilities. And so the Bay Area Toll Authority was developed by the legislature and given to the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in 1996. And that particular portfolio has grown quite a bit. It really started just to be responsible for managing the $1 toll that we collected at the time and really assisting Caltrans in working on the rehabilitation programs. The state kept most of the other responsibilities. However, with the development of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge and some of the challenges that it had, the state really decided we need to have much more strength in numbers. And so we created an organization through new legislation that really added to IBTTA's portfolio by giving all of the toll responsibility to the agency. And we're now up to $7 of a toll structure on our bridges. And it was really designed to salvage and finish the very important work of the new span at the east end of the Bay Bridge, replacement of an old bridge. But I think it really pointed to the qualifications that the agency had developed over the years of being really accountable to the public and really paying attention to sort of the transparency of how you do public work. Because I think a lot of times the state DOTs can maybe stay a little bit undercover because they don't have a board to report to. And so we created a joint venture with Caltrans, and we spent the next handful of years developing that particular program. But as time moved on, we've actually added a lot more responsibility. And so in the last handful of years, we merged our staff with the Association of Bay Area Governments, which is a council of governments, and most metropolitan areas have those. They were responsible for the housing plan. And so since that point in time, which happened a handful of years ago, we've really been trying to marry, in accordance with state law, the relationship between building, housing, and transportation and their complete nexus. But no good deed goes unpunished. And so just more recently, the state gave us some additional authority called the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And that's really a very beginning stages of an attempt to deal with the major housing problems that the Bay Area has that are not uncommon across the United States. And the game plan is in the next couple of years to put out a referendum to the taxpayers and see if they're willing to put a bunch of money into developing affordable housing and housing that's developed consistent with the regional transportation housing plan. So our portfolio goes all the way from the bridges through housing, and it's a pretty complex structure, but it's a pleasure to be working, for the Bay Area people and trying to do our best to keep the area vibrant. And I do think that what we've seen with the marriage of these agencies is a real quality experiment in good government, for one, but also a real opportunity to do some things that move the needle for future generations, which are clearly what we're trying to set the table for the next generation to come in and maybe correct some of the problems that we've created in our tenure of work.
Andy, thank you so much. You mentioned the Bay Bridge, which I think of as sort of the marquee beauty spot of the authority. And I think one of the first times we met was, I don't know, a dozen or 15 years ago at IBTTA offices, and you and Steve Heminger came to the office for a visit, and we had a lunch together, and you were describing this bridge, which you were in the process of reconstructing. And I was fascinated by the fact that it is a self-anchored suspension bridge. And I did a little research, and this the main span is the longest single tower self-anchored suspension bridge in the world. So tell me a little bit about the bridge itself and the project that brought this about, that made it a reality.
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, Pat. But I think it probably starts a little bit earlier than that, and it really is a representation of the effect of what a major earthquake, caused in the San Francisco Bay Area back in 1989. And frankly, that really was an opportunity for a lot of people to really see very directly how powerful Mother Nature is. One of the reasons why VATA was stood up, frankly, though, was the retrofit program took a long time, as well as development of some other bridges to get built. And this powerful relationship of marrying the DOT with the financing authority, I think really was sort of the champion that grew out of that very terrible event in 1989. What 1989 taught us in San Francisco was the earthquakes create a series of problems, as we all know, that weren't actually evident. So every earthquake teaches engineers new things. And the Loma Prieta earthquake, I think, taught us a lot about sort of vertical acceleration, which created and identified some of the vulnerabilities of our existing infrastructure. And so one of the things we learned about the old Bay Bridge that was operating just like it always had, and bringing 280,000 people to and from San Francisco every day, was really vulnerable in the event of another significant earthquake, which we all anticipate happening in the coming decades. And it pointed out to the fact that the east span of the Bay Bridge was really sitting on a bunch of bay muds that had a potential for liquefaction, which would really just cause catastrophic problem with that crossing. It was determined there was no way to retrofit it, but it took 20 plus years to go from that recognition to actually cutting the ribbons in 2013 and celebrating sort of the new structure that is much more robust and much more able to support itself during a seismic event. And so it's really a bridge that's made up of two significant elements. There is a several mile long viaduct that was built by Kiewit, Flatiron, Manson that was actually opened, but it didn't go anywhere in 2007 or something like that, and just sat there for a few years while we then worked on the self-anchored suspension, which is really the signature span. I'm not sure you could have picked a harder bridge to build for many reasons. One, a self-anchored suspension bridge requires it to be supported by false work before the cable goes up. So it's built in reverse order of a standard suspension bridge, which adds considerable cost to the project, but also a lot longer development time. And as we all know, false work is temporary construction. And so your added risk while the construction is going on is relatively significant. The steel port of the bridge was primarily built by a Chinese factory. The work was done in Shanghai. The general contractor was American Bridge Floor. And the nice part of the story there is American Bridge actually was the company that built the original Bay Bridge back in the 1930s. And their joint venture provided just incredible construction activities. We had the opportunity to go to China multiple times during the construction of the bridge, but the bridge was not just built in one place. It was really built all over the world. So many parts were fabricated in Japan. A lot of American work went into it. And so it was really, I think, a recognition of what the global community does when you have a big civil infrastructure project. But it was a challenge. It's got some geometric challenges. So there is, it's not a bridge built on a tangent, not built on a straight line. It's got a curve at the very end of the bridge, on the east end of the bridge, where actually the steel, the cables tie into. And so it creates an incredible geometric and engineering challenge. And I have to say, the engineers from American Bridge, as well as the designers, T.Y. Lin, really had to earn their money to make sure that the bridge was built in a way that worked and would work into the future. Our game plan is that bridge is not going to be replaced anytime. And so our job now is to make sure we take good care of it, operate it, and maintain it well. But it was really a labor of love for thousands of people. And I couldn't be more proud to be part of that team.
Andy, you talk about false works and building the bridge in reverse order, and I know all the civil engineers on this call are just totally geeking out. So if you are an engineer or a lay person, feel free to put your questions for Andy in the chat. Andy, you mentioned when you talked about the earthquake that we learn things about the area when we have an earthquake. And I remember Carrie Witt telling me at one point that in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the city fathers and mothers were so intent on rebuilding that they wiped away all of this evidence and learning, or a lot of it, in their desire to get the city back up again. And I wonder if you could share, one thing or a couple of things that we learned from the 1989 earthquake.
Sure, Pat. One thing that we learned, it was very evident to us that we're working on the bridge, was the bridge wasn't the only vulnerability. And so if you're familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area, most of the bay the bay is our centerpiece, and we've got 7 or 8 bridges that cross the bridge, across the bay. And referring to the gem of the bay, I always refer to the bay itself being the gem of the region. But what has happened over the years since the gold rush is the bay is about 50% the size it was originally. And so that's sediment and fill from, industrial construction, as well as just sort of bad environmental engineering from the 1800s that has really created a very different environment. And so one of the effects of the bridges is the approaches. The approaches are all on bay muds. And what we learned during the earthquake was it took just as long to get that pavement fixed because of all the damage that occurred through liquefaction as it did to take the bridges and put them back together. We're seeing that now with the climate change and adapting to rising tides, is that the entire infrastructure of the bay is pretty much at sea level. And so what we've learned through the earthquake, and I think through what we're learning with climate change, is that we've got to do a lot more than just retrofit the actual bridge. We need to pay attention to infrastructure that is much more vulnerable than a lot of the impressive steel structures and concrete structures that we are building with modern technology. So in a lot of ways, I think it's forced us to take a look back at history and sort of learn from development mistakes that were made hundreds of years ago and try not to repeat those kinds of mistakes. But, we can't move the bridges, and we have these long approaches that are at risk for liquefaction or sea level rise. And we certainly need to pay attention to that bigger picture, which I think is one of the most evident lessons that we've learned from the bridge. I would also add, maybe in a little more positive way, we learned a lot to maintain and keep a track of history. So the environmental document for the Bay Bridge gave us an opportunity to really kind of resurrect the history of the bridge and the importance of what it meant to the Bay in the 1930s. And we've salvaged parts and pieces of the bridge, and they're open to the public as art projects around the United States. I actually just came back, around California. I just came back from a trip from Joshua Tree and had the opportunity to see a Bay Bridge art installation that's actually in the town of Joshua Tree. And it's made up of steel members from the original bridge. Wow. Our facility that we work at in the Metropolitan Transportation Commission's offices has managed to keep and salvage some of the old foghorn bells. That are these beautiful brass bells that were built out of a foundry in San Francisco back in the 1930s. And so just making sure that you don't lose track of that history was a lesson, I think, that we learned from the past. Because to your point, they kind of just bulldozed San Francisco and started fresh after the 1906 earthquake.
Right.
And losing track of that history and that memory, I think, was a missed opportunity at the time, and one that hopefully is a challenge that future generations won't forget, because that history is so important for education and for really taking stock in the true adventures of the past.
Andy, speaking of history, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about IBTTA. You are now the president of the Worldwide Association for the Owners and Operators of Toll Facilities and the businesses that serve them. We just celebrated our 90th anniversary in Austin, Texas last year at our annual meeting. So we're now in our 91st year. And you have adopted the theme Bridging the Gap, which I think has some historical underpinnings. Tell us a little bit about your theme for this year.
Yeah, Pat, thank you for that. And first of all, I think my theme is really sort of built on the shoulders of the past, right? And I, first of all, just want to thank all of the mentors that I've had, and many of them have run this association. And they've been so supportive. And I feel like accepting the challenge of passing that torch on is so important. And so bridging the gap to me represents multiple things. One is just the illusion of the bridge, right? I think still at my core, I'm a bridge engineer, even though I've sort of turned into a planner and a toll guy. But I think at the core of my relationship with civil engineering has to do with my appreciation of these large, impressive structures. And so, bridging the gap is really a little bit of a homage to just the industry itself and how important bridges are. But I think it also represents so much more. It's how do you look back at the past and learn from both the positive and the negative, and then apply new solutions that either are reflective of lessons that we've learned in the past from mistakes, or are taking advantage of work that was done before. In fact, Bridging the Gap is sort of a retread. My memory is that one of your first annual reports was called Bridging the Gap when you were just a little kid, I think.
Exactly.
But
Elementary school.
Adaptive reuse is not a bad thing. Taking advantage of work that was done in the past, as I mentioned, is very important. I do think ultimately, though, it is representative of the challenges that are in front of us. And, this climate adaptation and what we do to really try to marry the goals of a tolling industry, as my good friend from the general population, Mark Compton, has always told me, we're responsible for collecting tolls, therefore we should have cars driving on our bridges and roadways. But really thinking about how you can adapt into the future and try to find alternatives that don't continue to sort of, take away from this wonderful world we live in and this very limited ship we're on. So from my perspective, it really represents sort of that anchor of what it takes to cross the divide, what it takes to, really remember and respect the past, but then try to make modifications in the future that work well, and to really pass that on then to the other side. And I really, have an opportunity now at sort of this stage of my career to kind of reflect on the next generation and what we can do to support them. So in a nutshell, I think that's what it represents to me. It's really just a continuation of the continuum of history, and making sure that we have an opportunity to do our fair share and pass it on and leave things in a little bit better shape than we found them.
Andy, I really like the notion of adaptive reuse that you introduced here, and the respect for history and the respect for things that have gone before. So often when people start talking about the future, they're always talking about innovation and doing something new or in a different way. But I feel that so much of the progress that we have made and that we can make is with incremental changes and maintaining the systems and the processes and the facilities that we have. That notion of adaptive reuse, of conserving and protecting what we've done and making incremental changes. Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things that we try to get across to people when they're asking about the next generation of bridges is really just the reflection that our job is to maintain them into history, because, bridges require a lot of natural resources in order to build them. There's a lot of desire, I think, to upgrade and improve by new construction. But frankly, California in particular, we have no gravel any longer. We have to get our gravel from Canada. Cement is something that is clearly important in the recipe of concrete. And cement plants are, treated as an environmental problem today, and they're closing down as we speak. So the idea that you can just keep building new infrastructure, I think, is probably the fallacy. And the recognition that you can maintain history and adaptively change the function of something has been shown to us over and over again. The Bay Bridge is a perfect example. The Bay Bridge was originally built to carry trains. I think today it's unfortunate that they don't still carry the trains, but it was decided that the automobile was more important, and it was the desire of the American public to drive. And so trains were removed and the bridge was adapted into a new generation of work that just involved the automobile. Our headquarters facility was built by the U.S. Marine Corps in 1943 for the war effort. It was only used for that for a short time, but then it kind of just evolved into a warehouse or an office building for federal agencies. When we took it over, we had an opportunity to tear down this concrete building or start from scratch and build a new glass tower, or adaptively reuse it. And frankly, it was probably one of the most efficient things we could have done. And we really changed the face of that building through a retrofit strategy and a rebirth that gave it a whole new life, but also respected the fact that we didn't need hundreds of yards of thousands of yards of concrete and steel that would have to be fabricated and rebuilt. So I think this idea of maintaining your infrastructure and getting the most you can out of it, and then also taking advantage of, again, this historical connection with some of the beautiful architecture and work that was done in the past that seems to not be part of the investment today, it gives you that opportunity to keep those ties together. And maybe it's a little bit reflective of the theme of bridging the gap as well.
Andy, there's a comment here from Steve Snyder as we've been talking about adaptive reuse. He says, looking after this ship we are on, with a thumbs up. Any thoughts about that? And maybe let me throw in another thought. And you've mentioned climate and climate change a couple of times, and it's hard to avoid thinking about that when you see the tremendous rains you've had in California, and the chaos and the washed out roads and bridges that have been caused by that. So, what do you, a few more thoughts on looking after this ship we are on?
Yeah, I'm glad my buddy Steve mentioned that. There's quite a few sailors in the group that are probably listening today. And frankly, when I reflect back on the history of the Bay Area, the ship was very important to San Francisco. The gold rush really was the kickoff for California's growth. And the way that people mostly got here was by ships. In fact, our transit card is named after the Clipper ship. The Clipper ship is the ship that was the sort of change of its generation that allowed people to travel across the Horn and get to San Francisco in relatively quick order compared to the previous ways in the past. And so that representation, again, of what history meant to growth and to development in the Bay Area is so important. But I think it also recognizes the need to protect. And if we aren't careful, we're going to find ourselves in a real difficult situation. In fact, we already are as a world community. And so, really taking care of our assets, I think is key. I think a lot of us in this industry tend to think quite a bit about the next project and the next development, but I know there's a good portion of us. And one of my favorite committees is really the Maintenance and Operations Committee, because those are the folks that really keep the roads open when you do have emergencies. When I look back at my career, again, one of the things I'm most proud of is the reaction to these emergencies. And so I've had the opportunity to respond after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. I was in maintenance for the Caltrans Bridge Department in 1994 and had the opportunity to spend many months down in Los Angeles, helping the community rebuild from that effort. As you mentioned, floods right now are a significant problem in the Bay Area, but on the other hand, we're finally getting some water. So I think we need to kind of balance that and again, sort of respect the power of Mother Nature. And then, just kind of clean up and get back to work. So look, I think the point is that we have a responsibility as humans to take good care of the ship and make sure that it's in good shape and doesn't need a whole lot of adaptive reuse to work into the future.
Andy, thanks for that. I'm going to make a couple of announcements and then come back to you, Andy, for some final words of wisdom. So to all our viewers, please don't forget to complete the survey at the end of Café IBTTA today. We really like hearing from you. And we've got some upcoming events. Tomorrow, January 12th, we have the DEI Virtual Safe Space Conversation that will be facilitated by Greg Bradley with Bradley Consulting. Those of you who attended the annual meeting in Austin got to see him in action there. Then next week, January 18 through 20, is the IBTTA Winter Board Meeting in Coral Gables. I know we'll see a number of you there. And please check the IBTTA website for details on all our in-person and virtual events. Well, Andy, tell us, what final words of wisdom do you have for us before we sign off today?
All right, Pat, I accept the challenge. As Jim Wilson showed us, accepting the challenge and throwing down the gauntlet is important. And again, I think I'll take advantage of stealing from others. And I have two favorite quotes that I use quite a bit. And so maybe a handful of you have heard them before, and I apologize for that. But the first one comes from the philosopher Voltaire, who said, "Common sense is not so common." And I like to reflect on that quite a bit, because I do think common sense is how you solve most of your problems. And I think it's a lost art in a lot of solution and a lot of conflict. is the fact that people aren't using common sense. The second comes from good old Winston Churchill, and it is that failure is not fatal. And obviously, sometimes failure is fatal. But generally speaking, when we talk about the work we do, it's okay to make a mistake as long as you learn from it. And I think that was the point. And so common sense is not so common. Failure is not fatal. I'll leave you with those thoughts, Pat.
Beautiful, Andy. Thank you so much for that wisdom from Voltaire and Churchill. And thank you for being our guest on Cafe IBTTA. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week in Coral Gables as we tackle our first board meeting together. And to all our viewers, Happy New Year, be safe, keep in touch, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks, everybody.